London adored spectacles almost as fiercely as it adored scandal, and on the first evening of the winter charity ball, whispers drifted beneath glittering chandeliers long before the orchestra lifted its bows. Every duchess displayed jewels inherited through generations. Every gentleman wore polished confidence like another decoration upon his tailored coat, and every smile concealed an unspoken calculation. Among such practiced elegance, kindness often arrived unfashionably dressed, while cruelty sparkled brighter than diamonds. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe paused beneath the marble archway before entering the grand ballroom, drawing one steady breath to quiet the ache behind her composed expression. Her ivory gown had belonged to her late mother, lovingly altered by patient hands until every seam whispered dignity instead of despair. Though its embroidery remained exquisite, discerning eyes would recognize that fashion had marched several seasons ahead, leaving the delicate fabric behind. She adjusted her gloves with graceful precision, lifted her chin, and stepped forward as though she still possessed every privilege that fortune had quietly stolen. Conversations faltered for only a heartbeat before resuming with sharper enthusiasm. Ladies concealed amused smiles behind painted fans, gentlemen exchanged knowing glances, and servants lowered their eyes with sympathetic discretion. Eleanor recognized every look. Pity bruised no less deeply than mockery. She neither hurried nor hesitated, refusing to surrender the only inheritance no creditor could confiscate: her dignity. Months earlier, her father's debts had consumed the Ashcombe estate, scattering loyal servants and reducing a respected family to whispered cautionary tales repeated over afternoon tea. Since then, invitations had become obligations fulfilled through politeness rather than affection. Tonight's charitable celebration welcomed every titled guest. Yet Eleanor understood she had not been invited because anyone desired her company. She had been included because omitting an earl's daughter entirely would have appeared indecent. The ballroom shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers whose countless flames reflected across polished floors like captured constellations. Fresh roses climbed marble columns, their fragrance mingling with beeswax candles and expensive perfume. Musicians filled the air with elegant waltzes while laughter floated effortlessly above them, light as silk ribbons. Yet Eleanor experienced the room as though separated from it by invisible glass. Every beautiful detail emphasized how completely she no longer belonged within such splendor. Lady Beatrice Holloway, adorned in emerald satin and glittering diamonds, inclined her head toward two companions with theatrical subtlety. "How courageous Lady Eleanor must be," she murmured loudly enough for neighboring guests to hear. "I confess I should sooner remain at home than parade my misfortunes beneath crystal chandeliers." Soft laughter answered her remark. Another noblewoman sighed dramatically. Perhaps hope still persuades her that some generous gentleman will overlook an absent dowry. Eleanor continued walking without acknowledgement, although each sentence landed with practiced precision. She had long discovered that answering cruelty merely nourished it. Across the ballroom, Baron Cedric Pembroke approached wearing the polished smile of a man accustomed to admiration. Earlier that week he had politely requested the honor of the evening's opening dance. His family possessed comfortable wealth, while whispers suggested he sought an agreeable wife more than passionate affection. Eleanor had accepted, grateful less for romance than for ordinary courtesy. Now his expression shifted uneasily as several influential gentlemen gathered nearby. "My lady," Cedric began, lowering his voice, "circumstances have regrettably altered." She regarded him calmly. "Have they? I fear my mother believes certain associations may invite unfortunate speculation." Understanding arrived before his next words. "Our dance must not take place." For one suspended heartbeat, the surrounding conversations seemed to retreat beneath the distant music. Eleanor offered the faintest smile. "Then your mother must be obeyed." She curtsied with impeccable elegance before turning away, leaving Cedric unexpectedly burdened by shame rather than relief. Many observed the exchange. None intervened. Near the ballroom's towering windows stood Julian Ravenshire, Duke of Ravenshire, recently returned after years spent traveling through Europe following the tragic death of the woman once expected to become his wife. Society described him as handsome with reluctant admiration, Yet those who studied him carefully noticed sorrow had carved quiet distances into his eyes that no title could erase. Since his return, countless ambitious mothers had attempted introductions, but Julian accepted invitations only from duty and danced with no one. His gaze followed Eleanor, not because her gown lacked fashionable brilliance, but because humiliation had failed to bend her posture. She carried rejection with astonishing grace, neither begging acceptance nor performing wounded innocence. Instead, she thanked those who addressed her kindly, complimented elderly patrons supporting the charity, and smiled gently at servants carrying silver trays through crowded rooms. Julian found himself remembering another woman who had possessed that same tranquil strength. His younger sister, Charlotte, approached carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "You are staring," she observed. "I am observing. There is a difference?" "There should be." Charlotte followed his gaze toward Eleanor. "Poor Lady Ashcombe," Julian answered quietly. "No." Charlotte frowned. "No. Poor are those who mistake wealth for worth." Before Charlotte could reply, applause announced another dance, but Eleanor slipped unnoticed toward the towering doors instead of joining the celebration. Outside, winter greeted her with silent snowfall that softened London's harshest edges beneath a blanket of silver. She descended the stone steps, unaware that another pair of eyes watched her departure with growing concern. Moments later, as her modest carriage lurched helplessly to a stop beneath the gathering storm, a second carriage emerged through the swirling snow, and its solitary passenger reached for the door before anyone could announce the Duke's name. Snow whirled across the deserted road in restless sheets, swallowing the distant lamps of London until the world seemed reduced to little more than white silence and the groan of straining carriage wheels. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe drew her worn cloak more tightly around her shoulders as her coachman struggled beside a broken axle, his anxious apologies carried away by the wind before they reached her. She had endured the humiliation of the ballroom with unwavering composure, yet standing alone beneath the winter sky, she finally allowed herself one weary sigh that vanished into the frozen darkness. Another carriage emerged through the storm with measured confidence, its lanterns glowing like warm stars against the swirling snow. The horses slowed before her stranded coach, and a liveried footman hurried to open the polished door. A tall gentleman stepped onto the icy road, his dark greatcoat catching flakes that melted almost immediately upon its fine wool. Even before the coachman bowed deeply, Eleanor recognized the quiet authority in his bearing. "Duke Ravenshire," the coachman breathed. Julian inclined his head with restrained courtesy rather than aristocratic pride. "My lady, the weather appears determined to become far less forgiving," Eleanor answered with equal formality. "It has already shown remarkable persistence." His eyes moved briefly toward the shattered wheel before returning to her composed face. "Your carriage will not continue tonight." I had reached the same melancholy conclusion. The nearest village is several miles away, and the roads will soon disappear beneath the snow. She understood what he intended before he spoke the invitation. "My home is less than an hour from here." A faint stillness settled between them. "I cannot impose upon your grace." It would not be an imposition. It would become a scandal. Neither pretended otherwise. Victorian society forgave many sins committed discreetly, yet it seldom forgave appearances. An unmarried lady spending the night beneath the roof of an unmarried duke required no evidence of impropriety. Imagination alone would supply every accusation by sunrise. Julian studied the gathering storm rather than her face. "I would sooner offend gossip than abandon a lady to freezing roads." She lowered her gaze. "My reputation has already become fragile enough. It should never have depended upon the opinions of cruel strangers." A corner of Eleanor's heart stirred unexpectedly at those words, though she concealed every trace of it behind practiced calm. "I thank you sincerely, but I cannot." The wind rose sharply, driving snow between them. Julian removed his gloves, as though laying aside the distance demanded by title. "Then hear one condition before refusing entirely." She waited. "You shall occupy the east wing reserved for honored guests." He paused. "My own chambers remain at the opposite end of the manor." Another pause. Every door between us will remain open throughout the night. Her brows lifted slightly. The servants shall witness everything. There will be nothing to witness. No door shall ever close. His voice remained gentle. If your honor requires open doors, then every door in Ravenshire Manor shall remain open. No theatrical flourish accompanied the promise. His quiet sincerity carried greater weight than elaborate declarations. After several long moments, Eleanor nodded once. Very well. Relief passed almost invisibly across Julian's features. The journey through the storm unfolded in thoughtful silence. Inside the carriage, the warmth from brass foot warmers gradually returned feeling to Eleanor's frozen hands, while rain and snow tapped softly against the windows. Neither rushed toward conversation. Strange comfort often arrived not through words but through their absence. Ravenshire Manor emerged from the snowfall like an ancient guardian watching over the sleeping countryside. Golden light glowed from hundreds of windows, reflecting across untouched snowdrifts. Ivy climbed pale stone walls despite winter's grip, while iron gates opened without hesitation at the Duke's arrival. Inside, polished oak, crackling fireplaces, and candlelit corridors welcomed them with understated grandeur rather than extravagant display. Servants accepted Eleanor's cloak with impeccable discretion, though surprise flickered briefly across several familiar faces before discipline concealed it once more. Julian addressed his household without embarrassment. Lady Ashcombe is our honored guest. Every servant bowed. No one questioned him. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper whose silver hair reflected decades of faithful service, personally escorted Eleanor upstairs. If your ladyship requires anything, she said warmly, only ring once. Your kindness exceeds my deserving. Mrs. Whitmore smiled. Kindness should never depend upon deserving. The words lingered with Eleanor long after the housekeeper departed. Later, dressed in a simple burgundy evening gown borrowed from the manor's guest wardrobe, Eleanor entered the dining room where a modest supper awaited beside a glowing fire. Julian rose immediately. I feared you might prefer privacy. I discovered solitude has already been my companion for too many evenings. He smiled faintly. Then perhaps tonight we shall inconvenience loneliness together. The meal remained elegantly simple. Roasted pheasant, warm bread, root vegetables, and fragrant tea. Conversation wandered gently through literature, music, forgotten villages, and childhood memories rather than painful histories. Eleanor confessed she painted miniature portraits whenever commissions appeared. Julian admitted he spent years rescuing neglected books from abandoned country estates because forgotten stories deserved second lives. Their shared affection for overlooked things drew unexpected laughter from them both. After supper, Eleanor wandered briefly through adjoining corridors until soft moonlight revealed an elegant music room untouched by dust despite its silence. An imposing grand piano stood before tall windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. You may play if you wish, Julian said quietly from the doorway. I should not presume. You would honor the room. Her fingers hesitated above familiar ivory keys before lowering gently. A delicate melody filled the quiet manor, tender enough to resemble falling snow itself. Julian remained motionless. It was the same lullaby his late mother had played every Christmas Eve before illness claimed her. He had never mentioned it to anyone beyond his family. When the final note faded, neither spoke for several breaths. I do not know why I chose that piece, Eleanor whispered. Neither do I, Julian answered softly. Somewhere beyond the warm windows, unseen beneath the relentless storm, another carriage stood concealed among dark trees. A cloaked figure watched Ravenshire Manor with patient satisfaction before turning away toward London, already carrying a story that would sound far more scandalous than the truth. By the following morning, London had transformed one honorable night into a delicious scandal. Newspapers arrived folded beneath silver breakfast trays, their elegant print disguising venom beneath polished language. Without accusing Lady Eleanor Ashcombe outright, each article hinted that propriety had been compromised when an unmarried lady accepted shelter at Ravenshire Manor. Facts mattered little once imagination accepted the invitation to perform. Before noon, Whispers traveled faster than any carriage, reaching drawing rooms, fashionable boutiques, and private clubs where reputations were traded as casually as afternoon gossip. Eleanor read the smallest column only once before folding the newspaper with careful hands. She refused to grant printed cruelty the satisfaction of witnessing her despair. Yet silence could not soften its consequences. 3 invitations scheduled for the coming fortnight were withdrawn before sunset. A charitable committee politely informed her that another patron would better represent their cause. Even acquaintances who had once greeted her warmly now discovered urgent reasons to glance elsewhere whenever their paths crossed. She walked through Hyde Park that afternoon wrapped in quiet composure while conversations faded abruptly as she approached. Mothers gently guided unmarried daughters toward different paths. Gentlemen tipped their hats with restrained politeness but avoided lingering. No one insulted her openly. Victorian society preferred elegant exile to dramatic confrontation. At Ravenshire House, Julian Ravenshire experienced a different form of judgment. His mother, the Dowager Duchess Beatrice Ravenshire, awaited him inside the library, seated beside a crackling fire whose warmth failed to soften the gravity upon her refined face. She had weathered decades of aristocratic expectation and understood the terrifying speed with which gossip could become accepted history. "You offered shelter," she began calmly. "I did. You acted honorably." "I believe so." She regarded him steadily. "Then why does every newspaper imply otherwise?" "Because scandal entertains more faithfully than truth." The dowager sighed with restrained sorrow. "Our family has survived wars, political upheaval, and financial uncertainty. I know. It may not survive relentless gossip." Julian crossed toward the tall windows overlooking frost-covered gardens. "If preserving our name requires abandoning an innocent woman to public humiliation, then perhaps our name deserves questioning." His mother's expression softened despite herself. "You sound remarkably unlike your father." "I hope so." The conversation ended without agreement, yet neither misunderstood the other's concern. She feared for the family's legacy. He feared something infinitely more precious, another failure to protect someone deserving of kindness. Meanwhile, Eleanor accepted a commission restoring miniature portraits inside a modest gallery whose elderly owner valued talent above fashionable opinion. There, surrounded by delicate brushstrokes and forgotten faces, she rediscovered a measure of peace. Painting demanded honesty beyond social performance. Every careful stroke reminded her that beauty often survived neglect more faithfully than pride. Several days later, the gallery hosted a small exhibition celebrating anonymous artists whose identities remained undisclosed until the event concluded. Visitors wandered thoughtfully among landscapes, portraits, and watercolor studies, while discussing technique instead of reputation. Eleanor paused before a display containing 3 exquisitely detailed miniature portraits she recognized instantly as her own work. Confusion rippled through her. She had never submitted them. The gallery owner smiled knowingly. A generous patron insisted they deserved admiration. "Who?" He requested anonymity. Across the crowded room, Julian stood quietly studying another painting, making no effort to approach her immediately. Understanding arrived before explanation. He had purchased her forgotten works from previous commissions and arranged their exhibition without revealing either her name or his generosity. By evening, the collection received extraordinary praise. Critics admired the emotional depth hidden within tiny brushstrokes. Noble patrons competed to purchase future works from the mysterious artist whose identity remained concealed. For the first time since the scandal erupted, society applauded Eleanor's talent, while remaining ignorant of the woman they continued condemning. Later, as guests departed beneath gathering clouds, Julian finally joined her beside the gallery entrance. "I hope you will forgive my interference." She looked at him with quiet astonishment. "You restored something I believed permanently lost." "What was that?" "My confidence that goodness still exists." They walked slowly through nearby gardens where spring rain had begun falling softly upon blossoming roses. Glass walls enclosed the manor greenhouse beyond, sheltering fragrant lilies and climbing jasmine from the evening weather. Candlelight flickered inside, transforming every raindrop into liquid gold. Neither hurried toward declarations. They spoke first of flowers surviving harsh winters, then abandoned estates reclaimed by patient hands, then books rescued from forgotten shelves. Every gentle subject concealed deeper truths waiting patiently beneath polite conversation. Julian paused beside a blooming white camellia. When I returned from Europe, everyone expected time to cure grief. Eleanor listened without interruption. They believed another season would persuade my heart to begin again. His voice remained steady, yet sorrow lingered quietly beneath every word. It never did. Rain whispered softly against the greenhouse roof. I buried my future beside another grave. He drew one careful breath. Until I watched a woman endure humiliation with greater grace than most people display during triumph. Emotion shimmered within Eleanor's eyes. You offered me shelter when others offered suspicion. You deserved better. So did you. Their gazes remained intertwined. I believed my heart beyond saving, Julian confessed quietly. Yet somehow you have persuaded it to bloom again. Tears brightened Eleanor's lashes. I loved you from the night you placed your cloak upon my shoulders, she whispered. Not because you are a duke, but because you treated me as though my dignity mattered. Neither noticed the partially opened greenhouse door. Two young maids carrying fresh flowers paused outside, hearing every fragile word exchanged beneath the candlelit glass. They stared at one another in startled silence before hurrying away, their astonishment outracing discretion. By the following evening, fragments of the confession drifted through London's drawing rooms until rumor transformed affection into certainty. At the Grand Harrington soiree, Countess Lavinia Vale lifted her crystal glass before an attentive circle of nobles and declared with smiling precision, "If the Duke values Lady Ashcombe's honor as deeply as everyone claims, surely only one respectable course remains. He must marry her." Every conversation ceased. Every eye turned toward Julian. Eleanor searched his face for an answer, but before a single word escaped his lips, fear conquered hope, and she quietly walked away. The silence followed her like a verdict into darkness. The morning after the Harrington soiree arrived wrapped in pale mist, yet no weather could soften the sting of the silence Julian had allowed to linger. London interpreted his hesitation as refusal, and Eleanor accepted that interpretation with heartbreaking dignity. She neither defended herself nor sought explanations. Before another rumor could tighten around her name, she quietly departed the city, carrying little more than her painting case, a modest trunk, and the fragile resolve to begin again where no one recognized her sorrow. Her destination was Ashcroft Hall, an aging country estate owned by the widowed Duchess Margaret Ellington, whose failing eyesight had not diminished her appreciation for beauty. The chapel attached to the estate contained fading murals painted more than a century earlier, and Eleanor accepted the commission to restore them with grateful humility. She found comfort in preserving forgotten masterpieces, believing broken things often deserved patient hands rather than abandonment. Each careful brushstroke became an act of healing she could not yet offer her own heart. Days melted quietly into weeks. Spring surrendered to early autumn, and golden leaves drifted through the chapel garden like tiny blessings descending from heaven. Eleanor rose with the sunrise, worked until evening, and spoke little beyond the necessities of her commission. The villagers admired her kindness without prying into her past, allowing her to exist as herself instead of as the heroine of someone else's scandal. For the first time in many months, peace no longer felt impossible. Yet Julian Ravenshire discovered that peace without Eleanor resembled a magnificent estate standing entirely empty. He continued attending parliamentary duties and charitable functions because obligation demanded it, but every ballroom reminded him of the woman who had walked through humiliation without surrendering grace. Every snowfall recalled the night she had accepted his shelter. Every melody summoned the quiet music room where grief had unexpectedly become companionship. Most painful of all, every sunrise reminded him that his silence had wounded the one person whose courage had taught him to hope again. Charlotte found him one evening standing before the unopened piano at Ravenshire Manor. "You are punishing yourself," she said gently. "I deserve it. You hesitated because you feared placing her beneath even greater scrutiny. I hesitated because I mistook caution for wisdom. She stepped beside him. Then stop mourning what remains unfinished. Her words lingered long after she departed. The following morning Julian mounted his horse before dawn and began searching the countryside, visiting estates, galleries, and churches where Eleanor might have found work. Weeks passed without success. Still he refused to surrender. Somewhere beyond pride and misunderstanding waited the life neither of them possessed the courage to claim alone. At last an elderly bookseller mentioned a gifted painter restoring sacred murals at Ashcroft Hall. Julian wasted no time. Rain accompanied him throughout the journey, turning narrow roads into ribbons of glistening mud beneath a sky heavy with approaching dusk. By the time he reached the estate, church bells echoed softly through the valley, while silver rain washed ancient stone walls clean. Inside the candlelit chapel, Eleanor stood upon a wooden scaffold, delicately restoring the face of an angel whose colors had faded beneath decades of neglect. She did not notice Julian until he quietly removed his hat and stepped into the aisle. Her brush slipped. For one suspended heartbeat neither moved. "You found me," she whispered. "I should have found you sooner." She descended carefully from the scaffold, keeping respectful distance between them. "I believed your silence had already spoken. It spoke only my fear, and fear sounded remarkably like rejection. Every word remained gentle, yet each carried months of concealed heartache." Julian lowered his gaze. "I feared proposing beneath the weight of scandal would seem like obligation instead of love. You never told me." "I know." Rain drummed softly upon the chapel roof while candles trembled beside stained glass windows. "I have replayed that evening every day since you left," he continued. "Each time I imagined choosing differently." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I imagined forgetting." "Were you successful?" Her silence answered more honestly than words. A distant clap of thunder rolled across the hills. The chapel caretaker entered hurriedly. "Your Grace, my lady, forgive the interruption. The river has flooded the southern road. No carriage will pass until morning." He bowed and withdrew. Another quiet settled between them. Julian looked toward the rain streaming beyond the chapel doors before meeting Eleanor's eyes once more. "May I ask something without frightening you?" "You may." His voice carried no command, only vulnerable sincerity. "Can we stay? Just tonight?" She searched his face, expecting uncertainty and finding only earnest longing. "Not because I wish to compromise your honor," he continued softly. "Not because the roads are closed. I ask because I cannot endure another goodbye spoken through misunderstanding." The chapel seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor walked slowly toward him until only a single heartbeat of distance remained. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, yet her voice never wavered. "Only if you'll be my husband." The words echoed gently beneath the ancient vaulted ceiling. Julian stared at her, astonishment giving way to overwhelming relief. Then, without hesitation, he knelt upon the worn stone floor where generations had offered prayers before him. From the inner pocket of his coat he withdrew a small velvet box. "I have carried this since the night of the Harrington ball," he confessed. "I lacked courage, not certainty." Inside rested a delicate sapphire ring that had belonged to his grandmother, its deep blue stone surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight like captured stars. "Eleanor Ashcombe," he said, his voice trembling with emotion rather than fear. "You restored hope where I believed only grief remained. You reminded me that kindness possesses greater strength than pride, and that love demands honesty before bravery. Will you grant me the privilege of protecting your happiness for every season heaven allows us?" Tears escaped freely now. "Yes." He slipped the ring gently onto her finger. "Fit perfectly." She laughed through her tears, and he rose to his feet, resting his forehead lightly against hers without surrendering the reverence that had always defined his affection. Outside, the rain gradually softened until only quiet droplets remained. The chapel bells began ringing for evening prayer, their joyful notes drifting across the valley as though blessing the promise neither title nor scandal had managed to destroy. Before they could speak another word, hurried footsteps echoed through the entrance. An elderly solicitor, drenched by the storm and clutching a weathered leather case against his chest, crossed the chapel with visible urgency. Breathing heavily, he bowed before Eleanor and carefully produced a bundle of sealed documents bearing the royal crest. "My lady," he said, struggling to steady his voice, "your father's estate was never lost through debt alone. It was stolen through forgery, and I finally possess the evidence to prove it." Silence fell once more, but this time it carried not heartbreak, but the promise that the greatest battle of their lives had only just begun. The chapel remained hushed after the solicitor's astonishing revelation, as though even the ancient stone walls understood that the future had shifted with a handful of weathered papers. Eleanor accepted the leather case with trembling hands while Julian stood beside her, not as a duke shielding a vulnerable lady, but as a man determined never again to allow silence to become injustice. The solicitor carefully explained that years earlier, after the death of Eleanor's father, forged financial records had been presented before the Crown's estate commissioners. Those false documents exaggerated impossible debts, allowing the Ashcombe lands to be seized and quietly transferred through a chain of influential noblemen. The fraud had remained buried because every witness who questioned it had either died or disappeared from public life. Only now had an aging clerk, burdened by conscience before his own passing, entrusted the original ledgers and signed testimony to the solicitor. Eleanor's first instinct was not anger but disbelief. Every lonely year, every whispered insult, every door politely closed against her had rested upon a lie carefully preserved by powerful hands. She looked down at the sapphire ring Julian had placed upon her finger only moments earlier, and instead of feeling bitterness, she felt extraordinary clarity. Her life could no longer be measured by what had been stolen. It would be measured by what she chose to reclaim. Julian gently closed the case. "We shall not answer deceit with vengeance," he said quietly. She met his gaze. "No, we shall answer it with truth." Her smile carried both gratitude and resolve. "Then truth shall be enough." Within days they returned to London, not in secrecy but with calm determination. Rumor rushed ahead of them as it always had, yet this time gossip struggled to outrun documented evidence. Julian placed the solicitor's testimony before respected barristers, who verified every signature and seal. Independent accountants compared the authentic ledgers with the forged accounts accepted years earlier. The deception unraveled methodically, each discovery exposing another thread of corruption until denial became impossible. The hearings before the Crown's legal counsel drew unprecedented attention from the aristocracy. Noble families crowded the galleries, eager to witness either the destruction of an ancient scandal or the restoration of an ancient name. Eleanor entered the chamber wearing the same ivory gown that had once inspired whispered ridicule. Mrs. Whitmore and the Ravenshire household had lovingly restored every stitch, preserving its elegance without disguising its history. She wished the world to remember exactly who she had been when society chose to judge her. The principal architect of the fraud, Lord Edwin Blackthorne, appeared confident when proceedings began. Decades of influence had taught him that wealth often outweighed honesty. Yet confidence slowly abandoned him as witness after witness confirmed the authenticity of the recovered records. Former clerks identified falsified signatures. Estate surveyors described unlawful transfers. Finally, the dying clerk's sworn statement was read aloud, detailing every bribe, every forged document, and every calculated deception used to strip the Ashcombe family of its inheritance. Silence settled across the chamber. The presiding magistrate removed his spectacles before delivering the judgment. "Lady Eleanor Ashcombe has suffered a grievous injustice. Her family's title, estates, and legal rights are hereby restored in full. Furthermore, all transfers originating from fraudulent claims are declared null." No applause followed. The moment demanded something greater than celebration. It demanded reflection. Many of the same nobles who had mocked Eleanor lowered their eyes, unable to meet the quiet dignity of the woman they had condemned without evidence. Outside the council hall, reporters hurried forward with eager questions, expecting triumphant declarations and righteous outrage. Eleanor paused upon the stone steps while Julian remained respectfully beside her. One journalist called out, "My lady, Will you pursue every family who turned against you? She answered with remarkable calm. If I spend my future seeking revenge, then those who wronged me will continue governing my life. I prefer freedom. Another asked whether she intended to exclude those families from Ashcombe society forever. She smiled gently. No house becomes honorable by locking its doors. Her words traveled through newspapers with astonishing speed, reaching drawing rooms that had once delighted in humiliating her. For the first time, admiration replaced curiosity. People discovered that forgiveness required greater courage than resentment. Several weeks later, invitations arrived announcing the wedding of Duke Julian Ravenshire and Lady Eleanor Ashcombe. No elaborate political alliance united the families. No strategic fortune motivated the marriage. Only love. The ceremony took place inside St. Bartholomew's Cathedral beneath soaring arches where colored sunlight streamed through magnificent stained-glass windows. White roses adorned every column, their fragrance mingling with beeswax candles until the vast sanctuary glowed with gentle warmth. A choir filled the sacred space with voices so pure they seemed to dissolve every cruel whisper ever spoken against the couple. Guests arrived from every corner of society. The Dowager Duchess entered proudly beside Duchess Margaret Ellington, whose grateful affection for Eleanor had blossomed into genuine friendship. Charlotte smiled through joyful tears. Mrs. Whitmore occupied a place of honor ordinarily reserved for distant relatives, because kindness, Eleanor insisted, deserved closer seats than blood alone. When the cathedral doors opened, Eleanor appeared upon her uncle's arm wearing a gown of ivory silk inspired by her mother's original dress. The restored lace from that treasured garment formed the sleeves and veil, ensuring that every step she took carried both memory and renewal. She did not walk toward rescue. She walked toward partnership. Julian waited before the altar, his expression free of aristocratic reserve for the first time since London had welcomed him home from years of mourning. As Eleanor reached him, emotion briefly overcame words. He simply offered his hand. She accepted it without hesitation. The bishop began the ancient vows, yet when the formal promises concluded, permission was granted for personal declarations. Julian looked into Eleanor's eyes. On a snow-covered road, I believed I was rescuing a stranger. His voice remained steady despite visible emotion. I did not know she would rescue me instead. You taught me that courage is often quiet, dignity is stronger than pride, and love grows not through grand gestures alone but through countless ordinary acts of kindness. Before God, before our families, and before every witness gathered here, I promise that no silence of mine shall ever again leave you standing alone. Tears glistened throughout the cathedral. Eleanor answered softly, When the world measured my worth by wealth, you measured it by character. When others questioned my honor, you protected it without demanding gratitude. You never asked me to become someone greater than I already was. You simply reminded me not to forget who I had always been. I promised to guard your heart with the same faith you placed in mine. They exchanged rings. The bishop smiled. What God has joined together, let no one separate. The cathedral bells erupted joyfully across London. Outside, gentle snow began falling despite the early season, covering rooftops and carriage paths with quiet brilliance. Citizens lining the streets removed their hats as the newly married Duke and Duchess emerged beneath a canopy of white blossoms and winter light. Children scattered rose petals while the crowd applauded not the grandeur of noble titles, but the triumph of steadfast love over relentless judgment. That evening, Ravenshire Manor hosted a celebration unlike any remembered in recent years. The ballroom where Eleanor had once watched invitations vanish became a place where every guest, regardless of fortune or family, received the same welcome. Young ladies without dowries danced beside titled heiresses. Artists conversed with ambassadors. Servants were invited to share the final waltz after the formal festivities ended, and no one objected because the example had been set by the Duke and Duchess themselves. Before the orchestra concluded its final melody, Julian turned toward Eleanor with the same gentle smile that had first appeared beside a broken carriage in the snow. "May we stay?" he whispered. "Every tonight?" She laughed softly through happy tears. "Forever, my husband." Years passed, and Ravenshire Manor became renowned not for lavish entertainments but for compassionate purpose. Eleanor established an academy where abandoned gentlewomen learned painting, music, languages, and practical trades, allowing dignity to replace dependence. Julian funded scholarships for talented young women whose dreams exceeded their fortunes. Together they transformed the ballroom that had once symbolized humiliation into an annual charity gala where no guest was judged by wealth, fashion, or family name. Visitors often paused before a single framed newspaper preserved inside the entrance hall, the cruel headline that had once attempted to destroy Eleanor's reputation. Beneath it hung another clipping published years later, "The Duke and Duchess Who Changed Society with Kindness." Whenever curious children asked why the painful article remained on display, Eleanor simply smiled and replied, "Because love is never proven by forgetting where it began, but by remembering how far grace can carry a faithful heart." As evening settled over the manor and snow drifted peacefully across the gardens, Julian reached for her hand beside the fire, and together they watched the flames dance with quiet gratitude, knowing that every whisper meant to break them had instead become the foundation of a love that would outlive every season.